The Running Water by Lolita. Once, when I was working in an LTC facility, I was walking down the hall speaking to a CNA when all of a sudden we heard the loud sound of water running in the bathroom. All the patients were in bed already, so I turned to her and looked like, "What is that?" We walked to the bathroom, which you could only enter by key, unlocked the door, and went in. The lights were out, so we turned them on. The tub water was running full blast into the tub. No one was there. I walked over and turned the faucet all the way until the water stopped running. I said, "Why is this water running? Everyone's in bed." The CNA said strange stuff happens in that bathroom and on the floor all the time, including lights turning on and off and stuff moving around or turning on in that particular bathroom. What's weird was I heard the water turn on as I was standing near that bathroom, and no one walked in, and the handle had to be turned all the way to the right to turn it off. They're Still Here by Courtney. I was working in an ICU and had a patient who would only repeat what was said to her and was still with her all night. One time I went into the room and she started telling me all the ways she died. I had died because of a narcotic overdose. I died because I took too much insulin. I died on a sunny Sunday afternoon, etc. Then later, she looked up at the ceiling and said, "They're all still here." I ran out of that room as fast as I could. Another time I had a blind patient who kept asking me what time it was all night long. One time I went in to check on him and he said to me, "It's the witching hour." It was 3:33 in the morning. I quickly walked out. The Man in the Room by Susan. I had a patient admitted into a room at 1:30 in the morning. He was alert and oriented. He was rolled in on an ER gurney and started freaking out about him. Can't we see him? That he's not going to stay in that room and he needs to be as far from that room as possible. We switch his room assignment and get him settled in. Later, in the morning, I asked who he is. He says that we need to have the room exorcised. He is apparently a very angry, dead, mid-40s male. He didn't like another man in his room. That room was always really cold, summer or winter, and the lights used to come on and off for no reason. Til Death Do Us Part by Kaylee. I worked at a long-term care facility as a night shift aide about 14 years ago. I worked a hall I had never been on before. It was like 1 a.m. and I saw an elderly guy walk out of a room down the hallway and leave the facility. I went to that room and the resident was awake. I asked her who she was talking to and she told me her husband always came to visit her late at night. I went to ask the other aide on the floor about it and they told me the resident was 102 years old and her husband had been dead for like 20 or 30 years. Swear on my life that it was an actual person leaving that hall. I could even describe his outfit and hat. Needless to say, I didn't work that hall much anymore. Come Play With Us, Katie by Kate. I worked at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and there's a little girl who appears at the bedside of dying children the day before they pass and tells them it's going to be okay. They even mentioned her as a household name in orientation. In Indy, at a children's hospital, we had a patient pass in surgery, but her room became haunted. A little African-American boy saw her one night and said, "She looks like me and has one of these and one of these," pointing to his central line in GT. She had also had a central line in GT. Here in Colorado, I just stayed at the Stanley Hotel. It's the hotel that inspired The Shining. Stephen King stayed there and felt like his bartender was a ghost. He saw 2 little girls on the 4th floor when there were no other guests in the hotel. I woke up about every 20 minutes to nothing in my room. But the next day, I had a sock on my perfectly made bed and a luggage tag and earring on my spotless bathroom floor. The next morning, I bought a book about the hotel's hauntings, and my hotel room was in it. Apparently, things go missing in one part of the hotel and show up later in my room. They also have a wounded veteran-donated flag that has a spot that has started to fade into a silhouette of the original owner of the hotel. This Near-Death Experience by Anonymous. I'm an ER nurse. I had an old lady come in by ambulance near death. She was a DNR, so we weren't going to do much for her. She didn't have any family that we could find, and the hospital was full, so we had to keep her in the ER for the night. Again, she was near death. When you've seen enough people die, there's no mistaking it, and she was almost there, barely responsive, pale, cool. Breaths were really irregular. Heart rate was up and down too. We just turned the lights down and kept an eye on our monitor, basically waiting for her to die. About an hour later, she's standing at the door of her room. She'd gotten up and put on all her clothes. We are all like, what the beep? One of the nurses went to check on her and she said she was hungry. Not knowing really what to make of things, we got her a chair, a bedside table, and went to the cafeteria and got her a tray of food. Lady sat there, ate all her food, talked with the staff a little bit. After about an hour, she told her nurse that she was tired and wanted to lie back down. We helped her back into bed, and within 30 minutes, she was dead. Not exactly paranormal, but in 22 years in busy-ass inner-city ERs, it's the weird things I've seen. And this one, by Simple Simon 6262. When I was a student, I got called in on a stroke patient. She had coded, and they were doing CPR. They worked for 45 minutes, but she died. They cleaned her up and called on the family to say goodbye. By the time the family left, she had been both brain dead and without a pulse for more than 45 minutes. Blood had filled her brain, and she was completely gray and started to smell. Suddenly, she sits straight up and called for her family. The nurses rushed to get monitors and equipment back on her, started working on her again. She stabilized, said goodbye to her family, and promptly died a second time. This Man in Black, by Anonymous. Used to work in a skilled nursing facility. I was usually assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. One night, I'm in the linen room stocking my cart, and I heard someone shuffle up behind me. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder. Turned around, and there was no one else in the room. The door was still shut. Another lady started to complain that a man was coming into her room at night. Again, Alzheimer's, so I don't think much of it. So to reassure her, I told her I'd check on her throughout the night. She complained of this man every night for 2 weeks more. When I asked her to describe him to me, he's real handsome and wears a black suit. Oh, he's right behind you now, honey. That freaked me the F out, so of course there was no one behind me. She died the next night in her sleep. These Hallucinations, by Anonymous. About 2 years ago, we treated patients during a fungal meningitis outbreak. Our acute care floor has a census of about 20. During this, at least 10 to 15 were meningitis patients, ages ranging from 20s to 90s. There are no shared rooms, and all the patients were in isolation, no contact with another. Many of them had the same hallucinations, children in the corners of their rooms, and auditory hallucinations of religious music. I had bacterial meningitis and had similar hallucinations. Kids, voices talking to me, people walking around my room staring at me like I was naked in a train station. My dad later assured me he was the only one there. It continued randomly for a few weeks after I left the hospital. I put it down to all the drugs they were giving me, but seriously, it really messed me up for a while. This Spooky But Sweet Goodbye by Jess Bandapants. I'm an RN, and while I was a student, I was caring for a lady who had end-stage renal failure, had a DNAR, and was shutting down. We were having a little chat when she stopped, looked over my shoulder, and said, "Bill's here, love. I've got to go," and swiftly stopped breathing. Read her old notes, and Bill was her deceased husband. A Surprise Hello by Sober Hungry. I did my clinical as a CNA in a memory care unit. I helped feed this woman. She never really moved, never talked. It was like she was in a coma or something. I would wheel her into the dining room, and I could hardly get any real food in her. I'm usually able to slide in some special ice cream. For days, she doesn't move or have any response. I'm feeding her one day and talking to myself, pretty much. And after about 10 minutes, she slowly turns her head and says, "Oh, hello." Then she just rotates her head back to her blank staring position. The Ghostly Patient by Samster338. I used to work in a personal care home. We had one resident die pretty traumatically. Nurses had to perform CPR because it was a full code. That night, the midnight staff said they saw him at the end of the hall, just walking down like he always did. then the alarm on the door to the outside, it was a secured unit for Alzheimer's dementia patients, went off. It was the door he always tried when he was looking to get out. The Ghostly Little Brat by Smelly Cheese Feet. My great-grandmother was 94 and just started suffering from dementia. She told the home nurses and me that there was a little boy in the corner of the living room who would taunt and tease my great-grandmother while laughing at her, telling her she was going to die. Well, at first, it was just, kind of a little disturbing, and we all shrugged it off because of her dementia. But then, stuff got real when my best friend came over with her little boy, who was about 3 or 4. The little guy pointed over to the same corner and yelled, "I'm going to beat you up." When we asked him what was that about, he told us that he saw another little boy in the corner and he is not nice. This Haunted Bed by Jules. Nurse here. I worked the night shift when a ward's patient's relatives came running to the nurse's station in a panic. "Nurse, nurse, come quick," she cried. "What happened?" I asked. "You have to see it for yourself." I ran to the ward where this little old lady patient was crying and holding onto the bed for dear life. Her whole bed was shaking. Now you're probably thinking that the lady was the one causing all that shaking, but she was this frail, practically emaciated thing. She couldn't have barely rattled the bed rails. The ward had only 2 other patients in it and their respective watchers. Everyone was huddled in a corner, shaking in fright. Apparently, that particular ward was seldom used, and the bed that the old lady was laying in was rarely occupied. People who have laid in it always complained of nightmares where they hear screams and laughter of angry children. I guess some restless spirits called dibs on that particular bed. This Reaper in Purple by Come In Me Bro. I worked for a short time as an EMT and spent most of my time with transfers. I had a regular who was an older woman that I took to dialysis centers across town frequently. One day she was being moved and I was in the back with her. She looked under the weather, so I asked what was wrong, and she said a man in purple had been visiting her. I asked if he was a relative or a technician, and she shook her head. She said the man would sit next to her during dialysis and stroke her hair. Thinking this was strange, I asked the center techs about such a person, and no one had seen her or remembered such a person. Visitors weren't really a thing at this center, so I assumed the patient was just imagining it. Well, one day we're actually heading to pick her up, and on the way into the parking lot, I see through the window something that chills my heart to think about. It sent shivers up my spine at the time, too, like I immediately recognized it, but I swear to God, I saw a man in purple scrubs standing in one of the big windows watching us drive in. And when we pulled out of sight to go to the pickup door, we walked in to see a bunch of techs rushing to my transfer patient. The woman had just suffered a heart attack, and we were unable to revive her, even at the hospital she was rushed to. None of the techs in that place wore purple scrubs. The Patient Who Was Scared to Life by Feng Yu. Patient comes in coding, and we're working on him, and we're getting nothing, so we bring in his wife to say goodbye, and she starts yelling at him at the top of her lungs. And he comes back. So we arrange to transfer him to a tertiary hospital, and he codes again. So she comes back and yells at him again, and he comes back again. Cut to, they are loading him into the helicopter, and he codes again. So they bring him back into RER after working on him for a bit on the helipad, and his wife yells at him again, and once again he immediately comes back. Eventually, they decide to have his wife ride in the helicopter with him to make sure she can scare him back to life if we were to code again. The guy ended up living and received a heart transplant and is still alive to this day, all thanks to his wife scaring the life back into him. That is a true marriage right there. Well, my friends, we've reached the end of our journey tonight. I hope these chilling nurses' stories have left you with a shiver down your spine and a curiosity for the unknown. Remember, the world is full of mysteries, and sometimes they're closer than you think. I'm old Nicholas Black, your guide through the darkness, and I look forward to our next encounter. Until then, keep the lights on and sleep tight. Good night.